I'm happy to invite our first speaker, Professor Daniela Dueck. Professor Dueck is the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities of Bar-Ilan University. She specializes in the history and culture of classical antiquity, and among other subjects has worked extensively on Greek geography and on Strabo. She is the author of Strabo of Amicia, a Greek man of letters in Augustan Rome, that came out in by Routledge in 2000, Geography in Classical Antiquity, that came out in 2012, Cambridge University Press, and The Illiterate Geography in Classical Athens and Rome in Routledge 2021. She has co-edited the book Strabo's Cultural Geography, The Making of Kolossurgia, that came out in 2005, again at Cambridge University Press, and the Routledge Companion to Strabo in 2017. She will speak on common sense geography as epic strategy in Virgil's Aeneid.
Thank you, Yuval. Congratulations, Ben, and I wish you many more years of creativity in health and happiness. Virgil's Aeneid, composed in the 1st century BCE during the reign of Augustus, stands as Rome's national epic, the story of Aeneas' journey from fallen Troy to the shores of Italy, where he would establish the foundations of what would become the Roman Empire. This 12-book epic consciously positioned itself within the tradition of Homeric poetry, engaging extensively with both the Iliad and Odyssey through allusion, imitation, and creative transformation. Today, I want to examine how this Homeric modeling extends to Virgil's representation of geographical space throughout the Aeneid. In Augustan Rome, the majority of the population remained illiterate, but Virgil belonged to Rome's educated elite, writing within a more literate cultural milieu than the oral environment in which the Homeric epics had developed over centuries. This literate context provided greater access to geographical knowledge through Greek scientific traditions and Roman administrative experience, creating, at least theoretically, better public awareness of geography and spatial relationships than had existed during the formation of Homeric poetry. Yet despite this enhanced geographical awareness, I will argue that Virgil deliberately adopts the experiential, common-sense geographical approach characteristic of oral storytelling traditions. Rather than employing the more systematic spatial knowledge available to him, he consciously models his geographical descriptions on the Homeric pattern of representing space through lived experience, intuitive understanding, and practical travel perspectives rather than abstract cartographic precision. I'm going to argue that throughout the Aeneid, Virgil deliberately employs what cognitive geographers call common sense geography as part of his sophisticated strategy of Homeric imitation. Common sense geography refers to the intuitive perception of space based on everyday experience rather than on systematic knowledge or accurate measurements. The way we naturally think it's about a 3-hour drive, or describe directions as turn left at the big palm tree. This cognitive framework relies on relative rather than absolute positioning, approximate rather than precise distances, and qualitative rather than quantitative relationships. While common sense geography appears naturally across various literary genres in classical antiquity as a reflection of ordinary spatial experience, Virgil's employment of these techniques in the Aeneid represents a fundamentally different phenomenon, a conscious literary strategy of archaization. Unlike authors who simply drew upon familiar spatial concepts, Virgil deliberately adopts the specific geographical representation techniques characteristic of oral epic composition, compressed distances, simplified spatial relationships, and experiential rather than systematic frameworks as part of his broader program of Homeric imitation. This represents a sophisticated literary artifice, what emerged organically from the constraints and cognitive patterns of oral composition becomes in Virgil a calculated technique for creating epic authority and traditional resonance within a partially literate cultural context. To understand this strategy, we need to recognize how common sense geography functions. In oral traditions, geographical knowledge was transmitted through narrative rather than cartographic means. This phenomenon was not limited to oral poetry, but appears across various genres throughout antiquity, a broader pattern that extends beyond the scope of today's discussion. Focusing on our immediate concern with epic poetry, we should note that oral poets working without written aids or systematic geographical records naturally employed what we might call experiential geography, describing space through the lens of travel experience, landscapes through landmarks rather than measurements, movements through relative rather than absolute directions, and distances through travel time rather than spatial units. This approach was not intellectually inferior, but rather functionally different, delivering spatial concepts through features grounded in daily experience and sensory perception, rather than precise measurements or mathematical calculations. These experiential approaches created what Pietro Ianni termed hodological space, geography organized along paths and journeys rather than abstract spatial relationships. Such representations prioritized narrative effectiveness and traditional authority over cartographic accuracy. They reflected how humans naturally process spatial information in daily experience, making them immediately accessible to audiences regardless of formal scientific education. It is crucial to emphasize again that common sense geography represents a sophisticated alternative rather than a deficient system. It employs different cognitive frameworks that serve distinct communicative purposes and often prove more effective for practical navigation and storytelling. As we shall see through several examples today, this approach demonstrates its own internal logic and functional excellence. To address this challenge, I examine geographical references in the Aeneid through two specific analytical lenses. First, I identify verses where Virgil's geographical descriptions follow patterns characteristic of common sense geography. These patterns include the use of relative rather than absolute positioning, the organization of space through landmarks and routes rather than systematic coordinates, the flexible treatment of distances based on narrative significance and temporal units, and the description of geographical features through experiential rather than systematic frameworks. Second, I examine geographical descriptions in episodes that parallel Homeric narratives, comparing Virgil's treatment of space with his Homeric models. This comparative analysis helps identify where Virgil deliberately adopts oral-style geographical representation as part of his broader strategy of Homeric imitation. My analysis reveals three consistent patterns of common sense geography in the Aeneid: simplified spatial relationships, compressed distances, and intuitive directional references. Clearly, the limitation of the time frame today allows for only several examples, which I hope will demonstrate my argument. When Aeneas crosses from Epirus to Italy, Virgil presents what should be a substantial sea journey as remarkably compressed. We are carried across the sea near the Carounian promontories, from where the route and shortest route across to Italy lies over the waves. And now dawn was growing red as the stars fled, when we see in the distance dark hills and low-lying Italy. Achates first shouts, "Italy," and the companions greet Italy with joyful clamor. These verses present the Adriatic as narrow enough that the Albanian coast and Italian coast are mutually visible, a dramatic compression of the actual distance of approximately 80 kilometers. The Trojans depart from the Carounian mountains as evening approaches, and by dawn they can see the Italian coast. This simplification echoes similar treatments in Homeric geography, where spatial relationships are often compressed to serve narrative purposes rather than geographical accuracy. In the Odyssey, the poet expresses the distance between Ogygia, modern-day Malta, and Scheria, modern-day Corfu, through time-based measurement, and 18 days crossing, rather than abstract spatial units. This experiential approach to distance Characteristic of common sense geography allows Odysseus' emotional journey from despair to hope to unfold within a framework that prioritizes the lived experience of travel over cartographic precision. Similarly, in the Iliad, the space between the Greek camp and Troy contracts and expands based on narrative needs, appearing as a brief sprint for messengers, but expanding to accommodate elaborate battle sequences when dramatically required. The presentation of this spatial relationship through the experiential perspective of sailors searching for land exemplifies how Virgil adopts the framework characteristic of common sense geography. The emphasis falls on the emotional moment of sighting Italy rather than on precise navigational details. This choice reflects the nature of epic poetry itself, a genre that operates through poetic license and prioritizes dramatic effect over scientific precision. True, epic poetry should not be measured by the standards of historiography or geography, but rather should be appreciated for its own poetic conventions and stylistic choices. The significant point here is that Virgil consciously selects the experiential oral style framework characteristic of Homeric narrative as his preferred mode of spatial representation, demonstrating how this approach serves his epic purposes more effectively than systematic geographical description would. The representation of spatial relationships in coastal navigation provides another clear example of this technique. When describing the journey along the southern Italian coast, Virgil presents geographical features in sequence as they would be encountered by sailors. From here, the bay of Herculean Tarentum, if the report is true, is discerned, the Lacinian goddess rises opposite, and the heights of Caulon and shipwrecking Scyllacerum. This sequence follows a hodological pattern, presenting locations as they would be encountered during coastal navigation rather than through systematic geographical positioning. This approach mirrors the structure of periploi, ancient sailing around texts that documented coastal voyages through sequential descriptions of landmarks, harbors, and settlement encountered along shorelines. These texts organized geographical knowledge linearly along travel routes, emphasizing practical navigation features like visual markers and sailing distances rather than abstract spatial relationship. The qualifier, if the report is true, si vera est fama, further emphasizes the experiential nature of this knowledge, suggesting information transmitted through sailors' accounts rather than systematic geography. These simplified spatial relationships serve multiple narrative purposes while simultaneously evoking the geographical representation techniques characteristic of oral epic. By adopting this approach, Virgil creates a geographical framework that reinforces his epic's connection to Homeric tradition while serving his own narrative needs. By presenting space through experiential rather than systematic frameworks, Virgil creates what might be termed an epic geography that functions as an integral element of his poetic strategy. The second major pattern involves compressed distances. Throughout the Aeneid, Virgil employs time-based measurements and spatial compression that dramatically condense vast geographical spaces into manageable narrative units. This technique serves both dramatic effectiveness and traditional epic authority. The journey from Troy to Italy, which would realistically require weeks of sailing with multiple stops, unfolds in dramatically compressed timeframes that serve emotional and thematic purposes rather than geographical realism. When Aeneas leaves Sicily for his final approach to Italy, a storm drives him to the North African coast in what appears to be a single dramatic event, compressing hundreds of kilometers of Mediterranean sailing into one narrative moment. The expression of distances through travel time rather than precise measurements represents another characteristic feature of common sense geography, grounding spatial understanding in lived experience rather than abstract calculation. In the approach to Crete, Anchises declares, Let us appease the winds and seek the Cnossian realm. It is not distant by a long course. If only Jupiter assists, the third dawn will set our fleet on Cretan shores. Here, Virgil combines the experiential assessment, it is not distant by a longer course, with time-based measurement, the third dawn, reflecting how sailors would naturally conceptualize maritime distances. Notably, Virgil employs time-based distance measurements, which represent the natural way people conceptualize space in everyday experience. We still use such expressions today. It's a 2-hour drive or about a day's walk, because temporal measurements incorporate the lived reality of travel, including variables like terrain, weather, or mode of transport that abstract spatial units cannot capture. This approach makes geographical information immediately comprehensible and practically useful. When the Trojans discover the error in settling Crete, their departure and subsequent wandering are compressed into a brief sequence. 3 uncertain suns, indeed, we wander on the sea in blind darkness, as many nights without stars. On the 4th day, land was first seen to rise at last, showing distant mountains and rolling smoke. The compressed time frame, 3 days and nights of wandering, creates dramatic intensity while maintaining narrative momentum. This compression reflects techniques fundamental to oral epic tradition, where temporal and spatial relationships are calibrated to serve narrative purposes rather than geographical realism. The compression of terrestrial distances becomes particularly evident in the Italian episodes of books 7 to 12 in the Aeneid. Military movements across Latium employ flexible scaling that allows rapid transitions between locations. The nocturnal expedition of Nisus and Euryalus provides a striking example. Having gone out, they cross the trenches and through the shadows of night make for the enemy camp, though first day would bring destruction to many. The geography of the battlefield is compressed to emphasize the heroic journey rather than realistic distances. The space between Trojan camp and the Rutulian positions, which would logically need to accommodate 2 substantial armies, is traversed with remarkable speed that serves dramatic rather than geographical purposes. This compression serves both narrative space and emotional impact while reflecting techniques common to oral epic traditions. By employing these techniques, Virgil taps into universal patterns of human spatial cognition that remain relevant and meaningful across cultural and historical contexts, creating a geographical framework that resonates with readers' own experiential understanding of space while simultaneously evoking the oral epic tradition. The third major pattern involves intuitive directional references. Rather than using cardinal directions or systematic coordinates, Virgil consistently employs relative positioning based on natural phenomena, visible landmarks, or the subjective perspective of travelers. When describing the approach to Carthage, Virgil organizes space through the immediate perspective of the approaching travelers. There is, in a deep recess, a place. An island forms a harbor by the projection of its sides, on which every wave from the deep is broken and divides itself into diminishing curves. On this side and that, huge rocks and twin peaks threaten towards the sky. The expression est in sequesu longo locus establishes location through experiential rather than systematic coordinates, using relative positioning that prioritizes the observer's approach to the harbor. The subsequent description unfolds spatially through immediate visual experience. The island forms efficit the harbor through the projection of its sides, objectu laterum, presenting geography as it would be encountered by arriving sailors. This hodological perspective continues with hinc atque hinc, on this side and that, which organizes space through the viewer's embodied position rather than through cardinal directions. The entire passage presents the harbor's geography through sequential visual discovery rather than abstract spatial relationship, demonstrating again Virgil's strategy. The description of Carthage provides another paradigmatic example. There was an ancient city far opposite Italy and the Tiber's mouth. Carthage is positioned simply as far opposite Italy and the Tiber's mouth, a generalized spatial relationship that emphasizes the city's narrative significance as Rome's great antagonist rather than its precise geographical location. The description focuses on cultural and mythological associations rather than detailed topographical information. When Helenus provides navigational advice to Aeneas, his directions rely on experiential markers rather than abstract geographical systems. When, as you are anxious, beside the water of a secluded river, beneath the oaks, on the shore, that will be the place for your city. This prophetic geography identifies a future location through a combination of visible landmarks, secluded river, oaks, shoreline, and relative positions. Beside, ad, beneath, sub, on the shore, litoreus, rather than through systematic coordinates. The approach exemplifies common sense geography's reliance on experiential markers rather than abstract directional systems. The pattern continues in the Italian books, where battle positions and troops movements are described through topographical features rather than systematic orientation. There is, with Winding Bend, a valley suitable for deception and the tricks of war, which on both sides a dark slope presses with dense foliage, to which a narrow path leads, and confined passes and favorable approaches bring. Above this in lookout points and on the highest peak of the mountain lies an unknown plain and safe refuge, whether you wish to meet battle on the right or left. Military positions are characterized through immediate topographical features, dense foliage, dark slope, narrow path, rather than cardinal orientation, while directional terms like utrinque and quod ducit present spatial relationships from the embodied perspective of someone moving through the landscape rather than through abstract geographical coordinates. The pattern that I have presented so far gains significance when we recognize their systematic correspondence to techniques that emerge naturally in Homeric oral composition. In oral tradition, geographical knowledge was necessarily transmitted through narrative rather than written records, employing common sense geography not due to intellectual limitations, but because experiential frameworks represent the most effective method for conveying and memorizing spatial information in oral communication. These techniques, relative positioning, landmark-based orientation, and time-based measurements, suit the cognitive demands of oral performance and audience comprehension, making complex geographical relationships accessible and memorable without written aids. The Odyssey provides clear example of common sense geographical representation, particularly in its treatment of Odysseus' wanderings. When Nestor describes the Greek fleet's journey after the fall of Troy, he details a navigational decision at Lesbos. After a long time, yellow-haired Menelaus came after us, and in Lesbos he found us considering the long voyage, whether we should sail above rugged Chios toward the island of Syria, keeping it on our left, or below Chios, past windy Mimas. These verses illustrate maritime spatial understanding. The expression kathuperte and hypernerte reflect a mariner's perspective rather than abstract cardinal directions. The description uses surrounding landmarks, Syria and Mimas, as reference points and relative positioning on our left to convey navigational options. Far from representing deficient geographical understanding, this section demonstrates how practical spatial knowledge was effectively communicated in a manner meaningful to its audience, exactly the approach Virgil adopts centuries later. Furthermore, the Odyssey consistently employs temporal units to express distance, as when Proteus describes the island of Pharos. Then there is an island in the stormy sea in front of Egypt, and they call it Pharos, distant as far as a hollow ship sails in a whole day when the shrill wind blows behind. This description locates Pharos relative to Egypt, in front of Egypt, from a Mediterranean perspective and expresses the distance in terms of sailing time under favorable conditions, paralleling Virgil's approach in the Aeneid. Here lies the crucial interpretive point. What emerged naturally in oral composition becomes in Virgil a deliberate literary strategy. This represents what might be termed oral residue, the conscious adoption of oral techniques within literate culture. We can demonstrate this deliberate quality through Virgil's selective deployment of different geographical modes. In the Italian books, he demonstrates familiarity with local geography, accurately locating the Tiber River mouth near Latium, describing recognizable features of the Italian landscape that would have been familiar to his Roman audience, and incorporating detailed knowledge of Italian tribal territories and their relationships. Yet in other contexts, particularly when we're narrating episodes that parallel Homeric tradition, he employs the simplified spatial concepts characteristic of oral epic. This selective deployment indicates conscious artistic choice rather than geographical limitation. Without delving into a detailed reading of the relevant episode, let us have a very quick glance at a summarizing comparison of the Scylla and Charybdis scene in the Aeneid versus the Odyssey. We see that both descriptions share several key features: the relative positioning of the two monsters, one on the left and one on the right of the strait, the experiential approach from Serlo's perspective, and the supernatural elements that define the passage. Despite Virgil's relatively compressed treatment compared with the Odyssey, the crucial point for my argument is that while the geographical strategy of the Homeric epics derives from the oral origins and therefore reflects natural oral composition, in the Aeneid we see deliberate Homeric imitation. Virgil transforms Homeric geographical techniques from natural oral composition features into deliberate literary devices that serve both traditional resonance and his unique characterization goals. His deliberate employment of common sense geography serves multiple poetic purposes simultaneously. First, it creates narrative flexibility, allowing him to compress or expand geographical space as dramatic needs require. Second, this approach establishes connection with epic tradition, creating what we might call an epic geography that resonates with Homeric authority. Third, it serves Virgil's complex ideological purposes, transforming familiar territories into epic landscape that can accommodate both historical reality and mythological significance. By adopting geographical representation techniques, characteristic of oral poetry, Virgil creates spatial frameworks that feel authentically epic to audiences familiar with Homeric precedent. The simplified geography of episodes like Scylla and Charybdis reinforces traditional epic authority while simultaneously allowing Virgil to adapt these episodes for his own narrative purposes, showing Aeneas as more cautious than Odysseus by having him avoid rather than confront these dangers. Virgil's use of common sense geography in the Aeneid represents neither geographical confusion nor simple poetic license, but rather a sophisticated engagement with epic tradition. By deliberately adopting spatial concepts characteristic of oral composition, Virgil creates geographical frameworks that serve multiple purposes. This approach allows us to move beyond traditional questions of geographical accuracy versus error to understand how spatial representation functions as an integral element of Virgil's poetic strategy. His epic geography emerges not as a limitation, but as a sophisticated literary technique that contributes significantly to the Aeneid's artistic achievement and cultural resonance. Thank you.